You're listening to Now I've Heard Everything, interviews from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s with voices from the past.
Prior to the mid-18th century, they would wait until the soil had supposedly dissolved your flesh, and then your skeleton would be extracted and put up in a place called a charnel house for decoration. And people would stroll through charnel houses on Sunday afternoons.
Professor Walter Kendrick. Today on Now I've Heard Everything, I'm Bill Thompson. So, do you like being scared? I mean, that is, do you enjoy horror movies and scary books and thriller TV shows? What is it about the thrill of fear that we like? A few years ago, an English professor named Walter Kendrick set out to investigate and wanted to find out why over the last couple of centuries our public taste in entertainment had taken such a dark turn. The result was his 1991 book called The Thrill of Fear. And if you like ghosts and ghouls and vampires and zombies, stick with us. I spoke with him just a couple of days before Halloween in 1991. So here now, from 1991, Walter Kendrick.
What I set out to do mainly was to tell an interesting and entertaining story. I do have a thesis about why we like to scare ourselves and why particular things scare us rather than others. But really, I just find that the history of the thing is so wacky and fascinating that I just wanted to tell an interesting story.
It is, in historical terms, relatively recently that we have come to use horror as entertainment, isn't it, if I'm not misreading you?
250 years is, historically speaking, a short time, and it's really only in that time that we've been scaring ourselves and getting a kick out of it at the same time.
Why has it been such a, again, relatively short period of time?
There's a number of reasons for that. I think one is simply that we reached a certain threshold, and by we, I mean the industrialized West, principally, a certain threshold in about the middle of the 18th century where there was a large enough number of people who didn't have to be scared daily for real just to get by in the world. And this gradually spread throughout Western Europe and North America, so that there was finally a large enough public to sustain an entertainment industry to provide fear and shock that was also fun.
Before that, again, if I'm not misinterpreting you, there were enough real-life horrors that we didn't need books and stories.
Right. Well, of course, not everyone lived in peril. I think Louis XIV was doing just fine. But there weren't enough people who had the leisure time to indulge their emotions in this particular way.
Not when people were dying all around you of Black Plague or death in the streets.
It was real in the streets, and so you did not want to try to have fun with it. It was too threatening in a real way.
Have our lives become so cushy that we need something weirder and gorier all the time to satisfy that need?
It certainly has looked like that in the last, say, 30 years or maybe 25 years. Though it's interesting to see William Wordsworth in 1802 complaining about the debased London audiences who are so calloused that they have to have one stronger shock and then a yet stronger one in order to make them feel at all. It sort of sounds like today, and yet he wrote it nearly 200 years ago. So I have the feeling that fashions come and go in horror entertainment in particular, but nothing fundamentally changes, so that I don't think we are all becoming terribly depraved and calloused about violence because there is that much more explicit violence in our movies today.
You don't go looking, though, for the meaning at the second or third level underneath the plot of all these stories to see what the authors are really talking about, do you?
No, I don't. That's part of why I think I've been able to tell a fun story. I mean, there have been a lot of books that want us to think that it's all about incest, or it's all about some sort of family romance, or it's all about class struggle. It may be about those things in some way, but horror entertainment, I think, is about getting a thrill out of being scared. It has been that way for 250 years, and it's going to go on that way as far as I can see. And that's the story I've tried to tell.
Where do you begin with a book like this? What does your primary research involve?
Well, fortunately, I've been a fan of horror movies, ghost stories, and the like since I was old enough to go to a movie and read a book. So that when the idea struck me that I wanted to write a book of this kind, I found that I had done a lot of the research already. I was able to refresh my memory by looking at movies, fortunately, most of which are now available on video cassettes, so you can rent them and look at them whenever you like. I had to reread a lot of things and also look around in a lot of the underbrush, especially of 18th and 19th century stuff, where it was ephemeral stuff when it came out. It wasn't intended to last. And some of it is hard to come by nowadays. You really have to go into the back stacks of libraries and dust things off that have been sitting there for 150 years. But that in itself is kind of, for me anyway, it's kind of an adventure. It's kind of fun.
Sounds like kind of a scary adventure just by itself.
Actually, yeah. It is. I mean, some of those libraries' backstacks look like the haunted crypt. They really do.
What prevents nightmares when you're writing about a book like this? When you're spending many months researching the things that have scared people over the last couple of hundred years, what lets you sleep properly at night?
Well, I think what happens is, you make a study of it and you objectify it. And you immerse yourself in it to such a degree that it can't affect you quite the same way anymore. I mean, that's part of the problem about writing a book about something you love. Once you're done with the book, you're sick and tired of it, and you don't love it anymore, which hasn't quite happened with me. I mean, I'm still fond of a good ghost story now and then. But I slept without a problem during the whole 2 years I was working on the thing.
You don't intend the book, though, to be encyclopedic and all-encompassing, though, I gather.
No, it couldn't possibly be that. You'd need a wheelbarrow to take it home in, if it were. I've had to be very selective, obviously, but I think I've been able to cover the course pretty well, from the poetry of the mid-18th century through the Gothic novel and melodrama in the 19th, to ghost stories and true crime stories in the mid-19th, to movies at the beginning of the 20th and up to the present with radio and TV. So there's a little bit of everything in there.
Many people, and you allude to this in the book as well, look at the way today's audiences, mostly young people, look at movies that do whatever they possibly can with special effects to scare us. The audiences, as you point out, often cheer or laugh in what would seem to a more mature mind to be all the wrong places. Are they laughing and cheering at the plot, the special effects, the character, Freddy, Jason? What is it? What's going on there?
I think they're laughing at the movie maker's failure to scare them again. A lot of young people, and I mean early to mid-teens, are really very well versed in this kind of movie, and so they're experienced. They know the tricks that the movie makers try to play on them. And they go in with an attitude of, bet you can't scare me. And I think the laughter comes in part from having been stronger than the movie's attempt to scare them. And so it turns the showing of one of these films into a surprisingly hilarious experience if you go to a movie theater to see them. I mean, there's all kinds of yelling and screaming and throwing things at the screen and shrieking and carrying on. In fact, it's exactly like an old melodrama audience hissing the villain and having a great time. And it has really nothing to do with the ghastliness on the screen.
Does this mean that they're all encouraged by what they've seen on the screen to go out and become chainsaw murderers? And
well, I think what people who view these things with alarm fail to give anybody, and particularly young people, credit for the real sophistication that they've got. I mean, today's teenagers have been raised in a world flooded with images of every conceivable kind, with advertising bombarding them from the time they can open their eyes. They know how to handle pictures. They know that a picture is not the real thing. Many of them, in fact, have become technological experts in special effects. They know exactly how the blood is made to spurt and the guts are made to spill. So I really sincerely doubt. Now, of course, there's bound to be a case out of millions, one person out of millions who will say, yes, I murdered everyone because I saw this movie. It's if the movies really had that kind of effect, though, it would be more widespread, certainly, wouldn't it? I think it fundamentally doesn't produce that kind of effect.
Does society impose its own limits? I mean, will it take a book like The American Psycho and say, this just goes a little bit too far for our taste?
I think the problem with American Psycho was that it wanted to be mistaken for art. It really wanted to be a class act and a horror show at the same time. And of course, most of the attacks on it came from the literary establishment, such as that is. And I think that's mainly, they were just slapping the guy down. He's obviously a commercial hack who's out to make a buck in the most cynical way he possibly can. But he also wanted people to believe that it was a fine artistic novel. Well, sorry, you can't have it both ways.
I really have found that what scares you is in your own mind. You don't have to, they don't have to produce all sorts of special effects and blood spurting or in earlier stories, they don't have to go to grotesque descriptions of everything. All they have to do is plant the seed of a suggestion. One of the scariest movies that I can think of is The Changeling with George C. Scott that scarcely has any scenes of gore in it at all.
Yeah.
But to me, it scared me enough to make me turn on all lights and go back to bed.
There are surprisingly few movies that manage to achieve that, though. And I think it's because, yes, I would agree that the suggestion of something dreadful that doesn't show you the blood right in front of your face, or in fact might not even let you see the monster, is much more effective. But it also calls for a lot more skill and talent on the part of everybody involved. And unfortunately, there just isn't that much talent around. So you get a few movies of that kind and a few books of that kind, which in my estimation, are really the best of the genre. But they rise to the top over a whole lot of sludge.
When we think back on prior years, we think primarily of books, but were there other media? I mean, obviously there were no television or movies before just a relatively few years ago. What other media were there 200 years ago?
Well, principally there was live performance, melodrama in particular. From the late 18th century up to the middle of the 19th, or maybe a bit earlier, ghastly and scary melodramas were very popular all over Europe and North America. And they were pretty ingenious, too, in their way. It's one thing that really fascinated me in doing the research for this book. It's one of the least well-known parts of the story's history, is that without electricity, in a theater where the stage was lit just as much as the auditorium was, where people were chatting and carrying on in the audience and oranges were being sold and so on, it was sort of mayhem. Still, they managed to produce fabulous effects of fire and ghosts vanishing before your eyes and things rising up from the ground and disappearing through the air. It's hard to imagine what it really looked like, but to read descriptions of it and the way audiences responded to it, they were tremendously resourceful and really quite fascinating. But that was the main other form of entertainment besides books that they had before movies came along.
Now, did I read you correctly that they actually at one time used actual skulls for a performance of Hamlet?
They did. Oh, yes. Well, I mean, they didn't have styrofoam. They didn't have plastic. What are they going to make a skull out of? They used a real one, surely.
I could use a big pile of dough or something, just
well, I suppose they could,
plaster of Paris or something.
But then they probably weren't as squeamish about it as we would be, because
that came across as the notion that there were a lot of things in times past that we would at today that they, I won't say took for granted, but it was just common that you use real skulls on the stage when you're putting on a performance.
Oh, well, certainly. I mean, I think squeamishness has grown steadily over the past 250 years. Prior to the mid-18th century, skeletons and corpses were by no means creepy things. They were fairly frequent occurrences in most people's lives. Cemeteries would sometimes be just open pits into which bodies were thrown, and your body, once it was buried, would not stay in the ground very long. They would wait until the soil had supposedly dissolved your flesh, and then your skeleton would be extracted and put up in a place called a charnel house for decoration. And people would stroll through charnel houses on Sunday afternoons, and lovers would hold their meetings there. And it's really quite astonishing and impossible to imagine the mindset that would put up with this. But in fact, there's lots of evidence that that was the case. And so my book begins at the middle of the 18th century, just the point where that started to change and Western culture started to clean up its act in regard to the dead and how they were disposed of. So nowadays, hardly anyone in the ordinary course of things has anything to do with a real decayed corpse or a real skeleton that hasn't, been sanitized and hung up in a doctor's office or someplace. So that's why we find them so creepy, because we know that all of that happens underground, generally speaking, and will happen to each of us eventually, unless, of course, they burn us to ashes. Yet we never have quite seen it, and so we just have suspicions of it, and we'd rather not think about it, but sometimes we can't help ourselves, and that's where horror movies and scary entertainment in general gets its power from.
Now, you can get a copy of The Thrill of Fear by Walter Kendrick by tapping on the link in our show notes or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. While you're at heardeverything.com, don't miss my 2013 interview with the author of one of the scariest books of all time, which later became one of the scariest movies of all time, the author of The Exorcist, William Peter Blatty.
It's as if I had landed on the planet with the manuscript of The Exorcist under my arm. It wiped out my entire previous history. Comedy? Blatty? Ah.
And my 1992 conversation with a woman who was a real-life ghost hunter, Lorraine Warren.
It was what I felt, the evil I felt, the oppression I felt. That was the area that we had the most trouble with during the final exorcism.
And don't forget, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And you can find us anywhere you listen to podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, 20 years ago, he revolutionized the eating habits of millions of Americans with his book, The South Beach Diet. So next time, we'll revisit my 2011 interview with Dr. Arthur Agatston.
Even though there's a consensus on how we should be eating, we're still getting fatter, sicker, achier, more depressed than ever.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.